Welcome to the Puzzle Advent Calendar. This is day 7, so if you're new to this, pretty much every day through December, there will be a new puzzle by a different puzzle builder each and every day. So, like never before, brand new, we invented these for this calendar. So you should make sure and subscribe to the playlist for the Puzzle Advent Calendar, and a shout out to Cubes Made Easy for organizing it. And if you want to make sure and see the next video tomorrow, that'll be done by Infrabread, and you should subscribe to his channel in the description. So let's jump into this. We're calling this new puzzle here the Commutator Cube. And first question is, why the Commutator Cube? Let's put it up next to a regular 3x3. It's about the same size as your typical 3x3. And let's take a look at how it moves. And we'll talk quite a bit about this. So you'll see these three faces. The white face has a little red pin, blue has a little white pin, and red has a little blue pin. And then the other sides, it's essentially a 3x3 with this corner blocked out, much like a fused cube. So only these three faces are working. And you may have just noticed, let's turn the white face. If I turn the white face clockwise, that white pin turns counterclockwise. And likewise if I turn it counterclockwise. Now let's go over to the blue face. If I turn it clockwise, counterclockwise. Counterclockwise, that turns clockwise. So it's like two gears that are meshing together, and they rotate in opposite directions. And the exact same rule for the red face. So the way that these pins work is identical across the puzzle. So these are constrainments, or they constrain the movement. They're constraints of the puzzle. So this was inspired by a 2D puzzle built by somebody else in the Discord server, the Puzzle Makers Discord. This 2D puzzle, I'll try and include a picture of it, was built by Ethan Wall, and he called it the 120-degree constrained puzzler. And it's the same idea. There was one face that moves, and it moves a peg that constrains the other face. And what we have here is a puzzle, a 3D puzzle, that does that across these three faces and links them in a cycle. And this has a really cool consequence. So how did I do this? Let me briefly explain. The centers of this puzzle, they go into a ball-like core, and in that core there's a handful of gears that mesh together, and those gears transfer the movement to the spindles in the center. So it's an interesting and kind of tricky mechanism, but it ends up working very nicely. So why is it called the Commutator Cube? Let me just briefly bring out regular 3D puzzle, Rubik's Cube. If you've solved one, you've probably heard someone say commutator. Now, what is a commutator? A commutator is basically what happens when you take two different algorithms and you do one algorithm, you do the other algorithm, and then you undo the first algorithm and then undo the second algorithm. So we can do one on the spot. Let's do the typical thing to rotate a corner. I can do this back and forth motion, and I've rotated that corner. That's one algorithm. Now I'm going to do another algorithm, just one move, and I will undo the first algorithm. Now I make this sequence of moves, and I undo the second algorithm. This allows you to, in many cases, allows you to isolate pieces. It's a very useful thing, and this would be called a commutator. So why is this called the Commutator Cube? Let's quickly go through a few movements. So every face is essentially the same as every other face. They function the same way going around the puzzle. I can turn the red face this way, or I can turn the red face that way. It doesn't matter. Like symmetry wise, it's just kind of flipped. Let me just pick this direction, and let's see what that does. That moves this peg there. I have two choices. I can move the blue face, or I can move the white face. Let's just go with the white face. I can only move it this direction. Okay. Now, what about blue? I can't move blue this way because the white peg blocks it, and I can't move blue that way because the blue peg can't rotate that way. And so blue is out. I cannot move it. I just moved the white face, so I need to go back to the red face, and it can only go this way. And, well, I could go back to the white face, or I could go back to the blue face now to make a move. I could have tried to make a double turn on red, but that is blocked because of this peg. So I only had one option there. I can move the white face. And the only way that the white face can move is like so. Okay, let's simplify that. These pegs are back in the right, the original starting position. But what did this do? This sequence was counterclockwise, clockwise, clockwise, counterclockwise. That is a commutator between this move and that move. So I turn red, I turn white, I undo the red turn, I undo the white turn. So there's a commutator. You may have noticed that there was one avenue that I left off. Instead of doing that last move, I could have done red, white, red, and then what about the blue face? I could have done this on blue. Well, what does this do? If I make this new move, this is not a commutator, but what can I move? Red does not move. I can move white, and I have to move white this direction, and then I can move blue that direction. Okay, I didn't do a commutator, right? I did 6 moves. I did something different, but what you'll find is blue, white, blue, white. Red, white, red, white, red. That was 2 commutators done after each other, where there was a move in the middle that canceled out. So every sequence of moves that you do on this puzzle is going to be a commutator between 2 faces, followed by a commutator between another 2 faces, so on and so forth. It only scrambles by commutators. So let's do a quick scramble and a solve. So before we scramble it, I want to make a few comments about how the pieces move. So we saw already that you can only do commutators. So what does this commutator do? It's going to move around these 3 edges. So it's cycling those edges around. And then what does it do to the corners? So if you'll check, it swaps these 2 corners and those 2 corners. And if I were to do this algorithm in a different location, you'll see that it actually, now it has swapped these 2 corners and those 2 corners. The corners on this do some funny things. If you only make moves up top that affect these edges, you will only switch 2 corners in 2 sets. So you'll switch these 2 corners and those 2 corners, or some other orientation of that. What about the other 3 corners? So there are 7 corners in total. These corners, what are the moves that move those around? I can do this. Well, I can't move back. I have to do this, and then I can move it back. Commutator. These corners, these 3 corners down here at the bottom, those can only move between each other. So what happens is, if these pegs are in their standard position, there are two orbits of corners. The corners up here, these four corners, orbit up here. They only stay in those four positions. And the corners down here can only move between those three positions. So that's the first observation when it comes to solving it that we will use. So let's just jump into it and start scrambling it. There's a really interesting bottom-up approach. We'll solve these three corners that are in their own orbit first. Let's see. This is in the right place and rotated. This is the first thing that we'll see. All the corners can be rotated, just like with typical Rubik's Cube. They can be rotated in pairs in any way. And edges can be flipped in pairs, just like a regular Rubik's Cube. There are 3 cycles of edges, and the cycles for the corners is interesting. We'll talk more about that at the end. We can do a little bit of group theory on that. So let me put these corners in place. This one is oriented correctly. This one isn't. And to orient them, you can't move them out of place and rotate them and do typical things. What you have to do is you have to swap them, and you make it do a track around these 3 spots, and when it comes back around to its original spot, it will have rotated. And I found out that the way to do that is you put the one you want to rotate at the back. So I'm going to do an algorithm here. So I just do the same algorithm all the way around, and then I put that back. It rotated it, but it didn't rotate it in the right direction. Yeah, those 3 are solved. And now we want to place these edges. This is very simple. You can do a 3 cycle of those edges. So we move it out of place, we move the correct edge into place, and then we undo things. This needs to go there. So let me 3 cycle them up here. And then I want to take the edge that was there, put it there. Now that's in place. And we've got it in place. And let's carry on with that. And we have solved those 6 edges. So now we just need to solve these pieces. Let's just get the edges into place. Cool. And we want to place the corners. Those 2 are switched, and those 2 are switched. Let's do this a few times, 3 times, and we can see 2 corners are rotated. Now, how will we go about this? I have an algorithm that rotates 3 corners around, and the way to go about that, we need to use that to get both of these correct. So let me think for a moment. If I rotate these 3 until this one is solved, I'll be able to fix it. There, we've solved that, and we've rotated those 2. Now, if I rotate these 3 until this one is solved, then I'll have 3 in place that can be solved simultaneously. We'll have to, there we go. Okay, those 3, and now we'll do this algorithm one more time. Hopefully we won't have to do it twice. And we're done. Cool. So it's actually not too bad of a solve. Hopefully I did that decently fast. So let's leave that there, and we can talk about the group structure for the permutations of these corners, because that's the main thing that's really interesting about this puzzle. So let's talk about some of the group theory behind the commutator cube. So first, let me just very briefly tell you what is a group. So a group is a collection of things that have a product or an addition, some sort of operation where you combine things. So is set G, and it has a product, or sometimes you'll see a sum be used when it's commutative. It needs to have an identity. So typically you'll see E be used, an identity, and it needs to have an inverse. So you might see G inverse be used. And these things need to satisfy what you think of when you think of a product of things. So what you should think of is something like the integers, I should say, the integers z with addition and the negation as the inverse. So if you take integers z, you can always take n plus m. You can subtract m from itself, and you get 0. And in this case, the identity is 0. So the axioms we have here are E times, now using the multiplication notation, E times G, the identity, times anything is whatever you put in it. And the same on the other side. And then the inverse needs to produce the identity. And that is the basic idea behind a group. So the great thing about Rubik's Cubes is these sorts of puzzles naturally give you a group. If there's jumbling, it's more complicated, but you can talk about groupoids for a puzzle instead. But the moves of a Rubik's Cube, the standard moves, say up, front, back, left, right, down. I think that captures it all. And the fact that you can do them counterclockwise or clockwise, those are different inverses of those standard moves. And these moves end up generate the group for the puzzle. And the way you figure out like what sort of group element do I have, you look at what does that sequence of moves do to the puzzle. If it's in this state, that state characterizes a certain group element. It characterizes all the ways of getting to that state. And that's a basic idea. There are other videos that go more in depth. So an important group that we need to talk about is the symmetric group. The symmetric group is a really basic group. It's kind of like the biggest group that you can have on a certain number of things. So let's talk about the symmetric group on 4 things, also denoted S4. So the idea here is if I have 4 things, let me just number them, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The symmetric group is all the ways to rearrange these things or map them onto themselves. So I could reorder these like 3, 2, 1, 4. And if I do this reordering, we see that 4 has gone to itself, 3 has gone to the first spot, 2 has gone to itself, and 1 has gone to the third spot. There's another way of writing this sort of group element, and that's with this sort of notation, 1, 3 in brackets. And to read this notation, all it means is that 1 goes to 3, and 3 goes back to 1. So if I wrote 1, 2, 5, you would read, if I plug 1 into this operation, it will spit out 2. If I put in 2, it'll spit out 5. And if I put in 5, it'll spit out 1. And this is a way of talking about elements of this symmetric group. It's just all of the ways of reordering 4 things. And so already you're talking about permutations. This is a great way to talk about permutations of pieces in a puzzle. So we'll come back to this in a moment. So let me write what a commutator is. We talked about the fact that our commutator cube only does commutators, but now with this notation, commutator in G, let's say between elements. So this just means I'm taking A and B from my group G. A commutator has a notation like this. And what it means is I do A, I do B, then I do A inverse, then I do B inverse. Or really, if you think about how does this act, I would do B inverse, I do A inverse, then I do B, then I do A. So up to a relabeling, this is a commutator. And when we look at our puzzle, well, our commutator cube here, if we pick 2 faces, let's say the front face and the up face, then the kinds of things that I can do, let's say front, I can do clockwise, up, I have to do counterclockwise. I can't actually do clockwise if I start off with clockwise. So one of the things that I can do is front clockwise, up counterclockwise, front counterclockwise, and then up clockwise. I have a commutator with U and F prime. And these are all of the kinds of moves that I can do on the commutator cube, which means that the group for this puzzle is a subgroup of the commutator group. So this is a useful group. If you ever study group theory, it's kind of like it's called a derived group, and it's important for a lot of different things, but it's the group that's generated by all of the different kinds of commutators of our group. So this group lives inside of the commutator group of this one, which is pretty cool. So you only take products of commutators of moves from your initial group. So let's talk about the positions of these corners. Now we mentioned already that doing this move will swap these 2 and swap those 2. So I could label these 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what does that double swap sort of move do? And it actually doesn't matter if I do it like this. I'm going to have a double swap between these 2 and those 2. There's nothing I can do up top that will get me away from that. The only thing that I could do is I could swap those 2 and swap those 2. You can't do a 3 cycle of corners up top. The only thing you can do is you can do a 3 cycle down here and a 3 cycle up here. So there's some interesting properties there. What does that look like? I have 4 elements up top. I have these 4 different corners up top. So if I'm just focused on those 4, these are the things that I can do. I can do nothing. I could swap 2 pairs of 2 corners in 3 different ways. And if you look at this and you think about how does this move things around in the symmetric group, this right here is a subgroup of S4 that we talked about just a moment ago. It's actually something called a normal subgroup, and it's called the Klein foregroup. Okay, so this is a nice special subgroup of S4. And there's something that is really funny that happens when you throw in these. So what happens when you throw in these other three corners down at the bottom of the puzzle? I can swap two. And what that does is it swaps two in this top set of four corners. That means that I can swap two of these at a time if I ignore the top four. So if I ignore those top four, I can implement any pair of swaps on these three. So I essentially have S3 acting here, though it'll mess up things up here. So I also have S3 for the bottom three corners. How does this come together? Well, these two groups come together in the form of something called a semi-direct product. So there's a special product of groups. So we have the Klein foregroup, and we have a semi-direct product with S3. And this is acting on the 7 corners of the commutator cube. This is a really funny action. We have the symmetric group realized on the positions of these 7 corners. So it's a funny action that's going on. And it's also really weird to have S4 show up as the group for a puzzle. If you think about how does a puzzle work, typical Rubik's Cube, what goes on here? If I probably should have not scrambled this, but what can you do on a Rubik's Cube? You can typically only swap. If I swap 2 pieces, I have to swap 2 pieces somewhere else. Or I can swap those 2 and then swap those 2, and it makes a 3 cycle. That's true for the corners. That's true for the edges. This is something called the alternating group. So typical groups for puzzles, you'll see a bunch of alternating groups. So you'll see stuff like A12, the alternating group on 12 edges of a Rubik's Cube. The alternating group, this is made up of all of the things where you have, say, 1, 2, let's say 3, 5, and then maybe 4, 6, and let's say, I don't want any overlap, 7, 8. Okay, this would be something in the alternating subgroup of S12. The things in the alternating subgroup have this format. You have pairs of elements that you swap, and you have an even number of them. And you can see if I have an even number of them and I stack them next to each other, I continue to have an even number in total. So the alternating groups are the things with an even number of swaps, which is precisely what happens for the Rubik's Cube. But in some weird way, because the commutator cube is the commutator cube, we have 7 corners that cannot do a 3 cycle, individually. 3 cycles are tied between the lower 3 and the upper 4 as 2 different orbits of corners. And those 2 different orbits come together to form a full symmetric group on 4 elements. I think that's pretty cool. I know I didn't go into a whole lot of detail on groups, but I just want to give a taste for why this is so special as briefly as I could. So I hope you guys like this puzzle for the Advent calendar, and I hope you tune in for the puzzle tomorrow given by Infobread, and I hope you guys have a happy Christmas.